I was the last piece of land standing between a $1 billion dream and reality, and they hated me for it. They didn't try to buy me out because they respected what I owned. They tried to break me until I had no choice but to sell. What they didn't understand was that every dirty trick they pulled was leaving a trail, and eventually, that trail led straight back to them. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for almost 30 years I lived on a quiet stretch of countryside outside Willow Creek, Tennessee, on a piece of land my family had held on to longer than most people in that area could remember. It wasn't some massive ranch or a fancy estate, just 4.5 acres of old pecan trees, a small farmhouse with peeling white paint, and a red wooden barn my father built with his own hands back in 1978. To most people driving by, it probably looked ordinary, maybe even outdated, but to me it was home. Every corner of that property carried a memory. The tree near the driveway was where my dad hung a tire swing for me when I was 8 years old. The back porch was where my mother used to drink coffee every morning while watching the sunrise. The barn still had scratches in the wood from tools my father used before I was even old enough to hold a hammer. So when a development company called Crestview Heritage Group came knocking with their polished brochures and expensive suits, I already knew my answer before they finished their first sentence. They wanted my land because it sat right in the middle of their planned luxury neighborhood, a massive project they called the Willow Ridge Estates. Their signs were everywhere, promising modern country living, 40 custom homes, private walking trails, a community clubhouse, the kind of place where people paid $500,000 just to say they lived there. The problem was simple. My property was the one piece they couldn't control. At first, they were friendly. I'll give them that. The first meeting happened at my kitchen table. A man named Richard Halston, the project director, showed up wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. He smiled a lot, the kind of smile people use when they already believe they've won. He slid a folder across the table and said, "Daniel, we really think this could be a great opportunity for you. You'd be able to walk away with more money than this property has probably ever been worth." I looked down at the offer, then back at him. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could put a number on something they clearly didn't understand. "I appreciate the offer," I told him, "but I'm not looking to leave." He nodded like he respected my decision, but I could see something change behind his eyes. That friendly businessman disappeared for just a second, and I saw the frustration underneath. Over the next few months, they came back again and again. The numbers got higher. The pressure got heavier. They brought up taxes, maintenance, the future, all the usual things people say when they're trying to convince you that holding on to something you love is somehow foolish. But every time, my answer stayed the same. No, I wasn't against development. I wasn't trying to stop anyone else from building homes. I just didn't want strangers deciding when my family story was over. That was when everything changed. The calls stopped. The polite visits stopped. And then, one morning, I woke up to the sound of excavators before sunrise. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Then I looked out my bedroom window and saw dust rising beyond the tree line. The construction had started, and suddenly my quiet piece of land was surrounded by machines, trucks, and workers who acted like my home was just an obstacle on a map. The first thing I noticed was the dust. Fine gray powder floated over my fence every day, covering my porch, my vehicles, even the leaves on my pecan trees. I called the site office, and they gave me the same answer everyone gives when they don't want responsibility. "We'll look into it." Nobody ever did. Then came the morning I found a massive yellow grader parked directly across my gravel driveway. It wasn't nearby. It wasn't accidentally blocking the entrance. It was sitting there like someone had deliberately decided my way home didn't matter. I walked up to the operator and asked, "How long is this going to be here?" He didn't even turn around. He just shrugged and said, "Talk to the supervisor." So I stood there, holding my coffee, looking at a machine worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting where my old pickup usually parked. I had to leave my truck on the roadside and walk nearly half a mile through the mud to get home. And that was the first moment I realized something. This wasn't about construction anymore. This was about pressure. They weren't trying to build around me. They were trying to make living there so miserable that I would eventually give them exactly what they wanted. But what they didn't know was that I'd spent my whole life working with my hands, fixing things, solving problems, and paying attention. I noticed details. I remembered dates. And when someone tries to push you off your own land, those little details become very important. Because the next time they came after me, I wasn't just going to complain. I was going to start keeping score. The next few weeks taught me something about people with money and power. Sometimes they don't need to threaten you directly because they believe they can make your life difficult enough that you'll surrender on your own. And that was exactly the game Crestview Heritage Group was playing. They never sent me a letter saying, "We're going to force you out." They were smarter than that. They wanted everything to look accidental, like a series of unfortunate events that nobody could blame on anyone. But when the same person keeps getting unlucky over and over again, eventually you start wondering if it's really bad luck or if someone is standing behind the curtain pulling strings. About a week after they blocked my driveway, I woke up one morning, walked into my kitchen, and turned on the faucet. Nothing came out. Not a drip, not a trickle, nothing. At first I thought maybe there was a problem with the pump, so I checked everything on my end. The pressure tank looked fine. The electrical panel looked fine. Everything inside my house was exactly the way it had always been. So I called the water company. A technician came out that afternoon, crawled into the roadside access area, and after about 20 minutes he stood up with a look on his face that told me something wasn't right. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "your line was cut during excavation." I remember just staring at him. "Cut?" I asked. "You mean someone hit it by accident?" He looked back toward the construction site and said, "That's what they reported." That phrase stuck with me. That's what they reported. Not what happened, not what they saw, just what they reported. 2 days later, my power started acting strange. Lights flickering, appliances shutting down, the kind of thing that makes you wonder if your house is falling apart even though you know it isn't. An electrician came out and found damage near the service line. Again, the explanation was the same. Construction mistake. Just an accident. Funny how all these accidents seem to happen around the only property that wasn't part of their development. I decided to visit the construction office myself. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't there to yell. I just wanted to look someone in the eye and ask a simple question. The site manager, Richard Helston, was standing beside a white company truck when I walked up. Behind him, machines were moving dirt like they were reshaping the entire county. He looked at me, then glanced at my old boots covered in mud, and I could tell he already knew why I was there. "Daniel," he said, forcing a smile, "what can I do for you?" I looked around and said, "I'm trying to understand why my driveway gets blocked. My water gets cut, and now my power is having problems. All while your crews are working right next to my property." He crossed his arms. "Look, Daniel, perfection isn't perfect. Things happen." I nodded slowly. "They sure do." He stepped closer and lowered his voice a little. "But honestly, you probably have fewer problems if you reconsidered the offer. The board's patience is wearing thin." There it was, the sentence I had been waiting for. The mask slipped. It wasn't about accidents. It wasn't about construction. It was about making me uncomfortable enough to sell. I looked at him for a few seconds and said, "I'll make note of that." He smiled like he thought he had won something. "Good. I think that's wise." What he didn't know was that I meant it literally. I was going to make note of everything. From that day forward, I stopped reacting emotionally and started documenting. Every blocked driveway, every truck crossing where it shouldn't, every cloud of dust rolling onto my property. I took pictures with timestamps. I saved emails. I wrote down conversations immediately after they happened, while every word was still fresh in my mind. My neighbor, Tom Alvarez, who lived about a mile down the road, even started helping me. He told me, "Daniel, I've watched those guys buy up half this valley. They're used to everyone saying yes. They don't know what to do with someone who says no." And he was right. Their biggest mistake was assuming I was fighting them because I was stubborn. I wasn't. I was fighting because I knew something they didn't understand. Land isn't just dirt. Ownership isn't just paperwork. Sometimes it's the last thing a person has that still feels like it belongs to them. After I'd gathered enough evidence, I started making calls. First, I contacted the county zoning office, then the environmental department, then the state water resources division. I wasn't expecting miracles. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted someone outside of this little battle to look at what was happening. And when they did, things started changing quickly. The county records showed something interesting. Crestree's project wasn't as secure as they wanted everyone to believe. Their development approval was conditional, and one of those conditions involved completing the acquisition of certain surrounding parcels, including mine. They had been telling investors they had everything under control, but the truth was they still needed the one person who refused to cooperate. Then came the environmental inspection. The creek running along the southern edge of my property was supposed to be protected with erosion controls, but after weeks of excavation, the water wasn't clear anymore. It was thick with reddish-brown mud running down from their construction site. The same creek where I used to watch deer drink in the mornings now looked like someone had poured coffee into it. I collected samples. I filed reports. I requested public documents. And the more I looked, the more I realized something important. They weren't just annoyed that I wouldn't sell. They had built their entire plan around the assumption that I eventually would. They had spent millions before they actually controlled every piece of land they needed. They had counted on pressure working. They had counted on me getting tired. But they had made one mistake. They underestimated how patient someone can become when they're protecting something that matters. And a few weeks later, I walked into a development board meeting wearing the same muddy boots I had worn during those long mornings watching their machines tear through the land around me. Everyone in that room expected me to be the problem. They were about to find out I was the one person who had been paying attention. The morning I walked into that courtroom, I remember looking down at my hands and noticing there was still a little dirt underneath my fingernails. I had spent the previous 30 years fixing fences, repairing old equipment, planting trees, and taking care of a piece of land that most people would have driven past without a second thought. And there I was, sitting across from a company that had spent millions of dollars trying to convince everyone that my home was just an obstacle standing in the way of progress. Richard Halston walked in wearing a perfectly pressed suit, carrying a leather briefcase, surrounded by attorneys who looked like they had never stepped foot on a muddy property in their lives. They looked prepared, confident, almost bored, and for a moment, I think they still believed this was just another business problem they could solve with enough money. But the thing about the truth is, it doesn't care how expensive your suit is. It doesn't care how many lawyers you bring into a room. Eventually, it catches up with you. The hearing started with their attorneys explaining that everything had been misunderstood. They called the blocked driveway a scheduling issue. They called the damaged water line an unfortunate accident. They called the power problems unrelated maintenance issues. Every single thing had an explanation. Every single thing had a reason. But then the judge asked a simple question that changed the entire mood in the room. If these were all unrelated incidents, why did they all happen to affect the only property owner who refused to sell? Nobody answered right away. And that silence said more than any speech could have. My attorney began laying everything out piece by piece. The timeline, the photographs, the witness statements, the emails, the construction records, the environmental reports. Suddenly, the little moments they had dismissed became a pattern. The dust covering my property wasn't just dust anymore. The blocked driveway wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. The damaged utilities weren't just mistakes anymore. Together, they painted a picture of a company that believed pressure could replace negotiation, a company that thought if they made my life uncomfortable enough, I would eventually give them what they wanted. But they misunderstood one very important thing about people who have lived in one place for a long time. We know the difference between inconvenience and intimidation. We know when someone is simply making a mistake and when someone is sending a message. The judge reviewed everything carefully over several weeks. And when the decision finally came, I remember the courtroom feeling strangely quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone already knows something big is about to happen. The judge ruled that Crestview Heritage Group had engaged in what amounted to constructive condemnation, using coordinated actions to pressure me into surrendering my property rather than respecting my decision to keep it. The development was immediately frozen pending further review. And just like that, the project that had been advertised as the future of Willow Creek came to a complete stop. Within 2 days, county inspectors arrived at the construction site. The machines that had been running before sunrise for months went silent. The trucks stopped coming. The workers packed up their equipment. For the first time in a long time, I woke up in the morning and didn't hear engines outside my window. I heard birds. I heard wind moving through the trees. I heard my old porch creaking under my feet. And honestly, that silence felt better than any victory speech ever could. But what happened afterward was something I never expected. The people who had supported the development started asking questions. Some of the neighbors who originally thought I was being difficult began stopping by my property. One man who lived nearby told me, "I'll admit it, Daniel. I thought you were just holding things up. I didn't realize they were trying to push you out, and I understood why people felt that way." The company had done a good job creating a story where they were the builders and I was the person standing in the way. They had beautiful signs. They had professional presentations. They talked about community growth and new opportunities. And I was just one guy in an old farmhouse saying no. But sometimes the person saying no is the only person asking the question everyone else is ignoring. Months passed, and the empty lots around my property started changing. The grass grew taller. Weeds pushed through unfinished concrete. The foundations they had poured began cracking from rain and neglect. Those perfect homes they promised never appeared. The streets that were supposed to be filled with luxury cars stayed empty. The dream they sold people existed only on a billboard that slowly faded under the sun. Meanwhile, my little farmhouse stayed exactly where it had always been. My father's barn still stood in the backyard. The pecan trees still dropped leaves every fall. The same dirt road that they thought was outdated became the place where I still took my morning walks. People sometimes ask me if I would do it all again. They ask if I regret not taking the money and moving somewhere easier. And I'll be honest, there were moments when I questioned myself. There were nights when I sat on my porch after another problem happened and wondered if maybe I was being stubborn. Maybe life would be simpler if I just signed the papers and walked away. But then I would look around and remember what I was actually protecting. I wasn't protecting 4.5 acres. I was protecting memories. I was protecting the promise I made to myself that not everything has a price tag. Because once you allow someone to convince you that your own choices don't matter, it becomes very easy for them to keep taking more. Now, I don't believe every developer is the enemy. I don't believe every person who wants growth is wrong. Communities need homes. Businesses create opportunities. Change is part of life. But there is a difference between asking someone to be part of the future and trying to force them into it. That line matters, and once someone crosses it, the issue is no longer about building houses. It becomes about respect. Today, if you drive past my property, you won't see the luxury neighborhood they promised. You'll see trees. You'll see an old barn. You'll see a farmhouse that survived because one person refused to disappear quietly. And maybe that's the part that bothers some people the most. Not that I stopped their project, but that I proved one person without millions of dollars behind them can still stand against people who think money gives them control over everything. So, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have taken the offer and moved on? Or would you have fought to keep your land even if it meant going up against a powerful development company? Do you think I protected my rights? Or did I stand in the way of progress? Let me know what you think in the comments, because these fights are never as simple as right and wrong. Sometimes they're about where we draw the line between growth and greed, between opportunity and ownership. And if this story made you think about what your own home means to you, share it with someone who believes that ordinary people still have the power to stand their ground. Because sometimes the smallest piece of land can hold the biggest story.